Coming up, the fight to wear Native regalia at high school graduations. We'll speak with a Native American woman who stood up to her school district 30 years ago and made national headlines for a fight that continues today. Plus, the Canadian snap election takes place next week. There are a record number of Indigenous candidates on the ballot. We'll take a look at the fight for votes from First Nations people. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian country today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Alaska's largest hospital is entering a crisis standard of care. Overwhelmed by a surge in COVID-19, they're prioritizing resources and treatments to those patients who have the potential to benefit the most. According to Indian Health Service, American Indians and Alaska Natives are 3.5 times more likely to have infection rates. Dr. Kristen Solano Walkinshaw is the Chief of Staff at Providence Alaska Medical Center. She wrote a letter addressed to Alaskans. While we are doing our utmost, we are no longer able to provide the standard of care to each and every patient who needs our help. Last week, there were 691 new cases and 6 deaths. Health officials said statewide that more than 200 patients were diagnosed with COVID-19. According to state health officials, more than half of Alaska's Native population are vaccinated. The staff says they expect an increase in cases for the next 2 to 4 weeks. Indigenous people in South Dakota are demanding their history be taught in schools there. More than 200 marchers walked, drummed, and rode horses in the streets of Pierre on Monday as part of the Oceti-Shikowi March for Our Children. The South Dakota Education Equity Coalition is calling for the resignations of Governor Kristi Noem and the state's Department of Education Secretary Tiffany Sanderson. This comes after the state's Education Department removed more than a dozen references to the Oceti-Shikowi before releasing proposed social studies standards a month ago. Kevin Killer, president of the Oglala Sioux tribe, spoke to the crowd about the importance of unity.
We look forward to continuing this fight into January when the legislature starts. And we're going to keep moving forward on these bills and just keep showing up, like we need to be unified. That's the only thing I can say is be unified when it comes to Pierre and show up like this one in January, February, and March when these bills come forward.
Public hearings for changes to the proposed standards will be held. Those demanding Indigenous history be included will be able to voice their support. The first hearing is set for Monday in Aberdeen. The Cherokee Nation is making history. On Monday, the Tribal Council confirmed Marilyn Vann's nomination to the Environmental Protection Commission. She was nominated by Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. Vann is the first Cherokee citizen of freedman descent to hold a government appointment since the 1940s. Chief Hoskin says the engineer's 32 years with the United States Treasury Department shows she is highly qualified for the position. The new commissioner spoke about the tribe seeking out the talents of citizens beyond their ancestry.
This is a sign that the Cherokee Nation is coming together to use the talents and ability to seek the talents of all of its citizens, regardless of their ancestry or their color or things like this. And it's time for this to, it's long past time for this to happen.
Vann is already on the job, reviewing previous meeting minutes and speaking with the nation's Secretary of Natural Resources. Well, it's pageant season, which means another new title holder. This past weekend, Shelby Mata from the Comanche Nation was crowned Miss Native American USA. Mata stepped in to fill in as title holder after pageant officials canceled this year's competition due to COVID. She was originally first runner-up in the 2019 pageant, and she is now the first from Oklahoma to hold this title.
So I think it is a big step for our state, for my Comanche Nation to have representatives. Most of the title holders have been from the New Mexico, Arizona area. So to be the first from Oklahoma is honestly honoring. Might have a little bit of an accent. I don't know. I can't really tell. But I'm super excited to just bring it home to Oklahoma and share it with everybody here in my small town. Not many people know where Walters is. We're literally just close enough to the Texas border that you wouldn't even see us on the map. So it's truly an honor. This is a big step, and I hope that it encourages anybody from a small town, or if they don't think they can do something, just to go out and try, because if I can do it, they definitely can.
The 24-year-old was crowned in a live virtual ceremony by the Comanche chairman. The Miss Native American USA pageant is a national competition. Its mission is to encourage Native women to achieve their personal goals and develop leadership skills. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Dolohungva. Coming up, from Alaska to Arizona, Native students want to wear traditional items during graduation. We speak to one woman who made national news when she fought for that right 30 years ago. Sophia Marjanovic was just 17 years old when she found herself in the national spotlight for wanting to wear her Lakota regalia to her high school graduation. In 1992, Marjanovic's request to wear anything other than a cap and gown was considered controversial, and because of the attention, she was targeted by conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh. She joins us today to talk about a problem that hasn't gone away in the 30 years since her fight began. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you for having me.
Did you have any idea how much national attention your request would get you?
I had no idea whatsoever. I was simply a 17-year-old child who wanted to represent and be proud of my heritage.
And at the time you were graduating from a high school in Tempe, Arizona, and what made you want to wear your Lakota regalia to graduation?
Well, I was a child who grew up in South Phoenix, and I was bused to Tempe High. And it was very clear to me that those children from South Phoenix were literally treated like trash by the children of professors of ASU. We were bused to a more affluent and more well-educated community, and I heard it. They assumed I was, because I was in the honors classes, they assumed that I was also someone in their community. So I listened to what they said about those of us in South Phoenix. And I knew that, the cap and gown, which was supposed to unify apparently everyone on the, equal, I was like, I'm not entering the world equal as everyone else, especially at this school. I'm going to have a lot more challenges compared to what these other people, like a lot of the privileges these other people that I'm competing against, have.
And so you took that stand, and who did you ask first for that permission? Did you go to the school principal? Tell us about that process.
Yeah, if I can remember correctly, it was about 30 years ago. I think I went to the principal first. I do remember that. And then I think they were very concerned and cautious and I think they said they were going to have to ask. And then eventually we had another meeting and they told me no. And then I appealed this decision and went to the school board, and I think they told me no. And then that's when I think my mother was very, she was able to access the media, and definitely the media chimed in, and professors, indigenous professors such as Dr. Ridingen at Arizona State University started chiming into the issue. I was recently reviewing, because I haven't seen these articles in, 30 years. I was reviewing op-eds. There were tons of op-eds back then where people were chiming into the issue and basically saying, hey, this child is an honor student. Let her do what she wants. She's earned her ability, to show that she's someone who is intelligent and is definitely trying to make changes in this country.
And then when it hit the national spotlight and you were targeted by Rush Limbaugh, tell us about that process, because the fight continues today, and we'll get to that part of the story. But back then, to be that target, and again, as you mentioned, 17-year-olds, you're still a child, but to have that kind of national anger directed at you, how did you deal with that?
It was extremely frightening. I was 17 years old. I hadn't dated in my life yet. And from what I had heard, he had basically implied that I was sexually promiscuous, which is a thing that Indigenous women and girls are often, placed in, that identity is placed onto us, whether or not we are that way. And that was terrifying to have a white man with with a national platform targeting a child, just basically a mediocre white man who was targeting an honor student. A child who is an honor student, a mediocre white man, has been given a platform. I was reviewing his trying to find the show where he targeted me, and I was realizing this white man is mediocre. How was he given C-SPAN airtime to comment about the presidential elections when this man really all he did was just have a big mouth? And yet here I am. In my life, I've accomplished not only getting a bachelor's in chemistry, but a PhD in immunology and microbiology, because my community, my tribal community, was targeted for or used as a dumping ground for the oil industry. I'm looking at how unfair this country is.
You've probably watched through the years all of these other students who stood up and said they want to be able to wear their native regalia at graduations. And slowly states are starting to put into place laws that allow that to happen. What are you thinking as you're seeing this finally start to come together when you started the process 30 years ago?
One, the first reaction that I have had to all of the stories that I've seen over the years is, really? I dealt with this, over the years. I was like, I dealt with this back in 1992. What's the big deal with this country? Why does it not respect the fact that they are on stolen Indigenous land? Just seeing how Indigenous children still have to fight for, this 30 years later, it really hurts, because it shows how much this country intentionally did not want Indigenous children to especially have pride in who we are.
You mentioned your education and what you've been able to do with your life. Tell us a little bit about your work with the Court Accountability Project.
I began court watching programs after being a volunteer in other programs, and was realizing the other programs were very problematic. They often didn't have people who understood the dynamics of domestic violence. And so they were actually doing more harm because they didn't realize that, when an abuser is basically pushing someone's buttons, and if someone has PTSD from from the abuse. They don't look exactly, that sane in the courts. And so, so I began this program. I realized my case was not it was not an anomaly. In 70 to 90% of cases, women lose custody of their children to abusers in this country. And so I started documenting these cases in the DC area, Maryland, DC, Virginia area. When the CDC eviction moratorium happened, I was realizing I had friends and friends who were, and community members who were facing eviction despite the CDC moratorium. So we started a collective here, Court Accountability Project, and we just began documenting the corruption in the courts.
Thank you, Sophia, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Next week, Canada will hold what's called a snap election, and candidates are working hard to get the Indigenous vote. There are several historic firsts happening in this race. Indigenous organizations are endorsing candidates for the first time, and more Indigenous candidates are running for office. Here to explain about the elections is Miles Morisseau. He's a reporter based in the Métis community of Grand Rapids, Manitoba, Canada, and has reported for the CBC Radio, and is even a former editor-in-chief of Indian Country Today. Welcome, Miles.
Welcome, Patty. Good to be here.
Well, let's start by you just explaining, what is a snap election?
Well, that was the first thing when I filed this story for Indian Country Today and sent to one of your editors, and the response was, like the story, there's a few questions. First off, what do you mean by a snap election? And I went, oh, right. This is not something that would happen in the United States. The president just couldn't call an election whenever they felt like calling an election. So, but in Canada, the prime minister does have the right to call an election at any time. And the prime minister does not require any support from his own party. For those folks that have to go out and campaign, doesn't have to clear it with them. Simply has to decide that they want to call the election, and they have the power to do that. And so 18 months into a 4-year mandate, we have an election called, and Prime Minister Trudeau is, facing the electric coming up in a couple of days on the 20th of September.
And the other difference in Canada is that there are more than two parties at play. In the U.S., there are other parties, but typically it's either the Democrat or the Republican Party that are running and then actually get elected to office. But in Canada, it's a different story. So let's talk a little bit about the parties and then the Native candidates who are running.
Sure, absolutely. Well, correct. There are the similarities with Canada and the United States is that we have the conservative, which would be the Republicans, and the liberals, which would be the Democrats, and that has largely been a two-party system up until the early 1970s, with the arrival of the New Democratic Party, which was a more socialist, left-leaning party than the liberals. They started to gain support, and so you had a third voice in there. And then in the 1990s, the Bloc Québécois split and is now a party that runs in a federal election, but whose only goal is to serve the needs of Quebec and to serve the notion of Quebec becoming a separate sovereign country. But because Quebec is, I would say, similar to California in that they represent so much of the votes that it becomes the province that will decide who the prime minister is. So we have a history in Canada, a long history of prime ministers who are Quebecois, who are francophone, because those Quebec votes will decide who the prime minister is. But now you've pulled that Quebec vote into a very specific kind of a fourth party. So they play the role of holding the balance of power, but they will never lead the government. Like a party that is only for a province is never going to lead. But nevertheless, because that province is so vote rich, they carry a significant weight on deciding who becomes the prime minister, who leads, and how the power is shared. So even though we have two main parties, what has happened now in the last number of election cycles, we end up with a minority government, which means those smaller parties like the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, they hold the balance of power.
Well, let's turn to the Indigenous candidates because there's a record number of them running this time.
That's correct, yes. So we have at least 77 candidates. The last election, which was, again, only 18 months ago, but there were 62 candidates that ran in that election. There's 77 in this election. And so we have that change where we have a greater number of, that's a significant jump in an 18-month period, to go from 62 to 77 candidates. And now we have parties like, political organizations like up here, the MKO, the Manitoba Kiwetoni Okanagan, they are openly supporting the Liberal candidate in the North and have passed resolutions about asking their people to vote for a specific party. So that is also something that's new in our politics, because generally the First Nation is going to have to deal with whomever becomes elected. So generally, it doesn't serve that well to openly support a candidate who may not, then you may not have to deal with that person at all.
Well, and in this case, they're supporting the Indigenous candidate. Let's talk issues very quickly here. What are the issues? The residential school issue up there, coronavirus?
Absolutely, the residential school is such a big issue in the country as we deal with reconciliation, as we've come as Indigenous people, understanding the history of the country, understanding the history of the genocide. But now, as the world we're finding thousands now. Started with 215 at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, unmarked graves of children, and now we're into thousands. And so
that's an issue that's really at the forefront.
That is the huge issue for reconciliation in this election. And how are these parties offering to provide some reconciliation with this history between Indigenous people in Canada?
Well, election is next week. We will return to you for reporting on the results here. Miles Merso, thank you so much for joining us.
Patty, thanks so much for your time.
An opening weekend is finally here for the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City. When we come back, we'll give you a sneak peek. It's been in the making for decades, and now the First Americans Museum is opening in Oklahoma City. As Caitlin Onawa-Boycell reports, the museum will include representation from all 39 tribes in Oklahoma.
A museum that's been in the making since the 1980s is finally opening up. It sits on a 40-acre site along the Oklahoma River at the crossroads of America. The thoughtful design highlights all 39 tribes, including the Delaware, Choctaw, and Kaw.
This site, though, was a former oil field, and in fact, I believe it was called Oil Field Number 1. In the early 1900s, it produced about 60% of the domestic oil supply.
So even before they broke ground, they had to repair the land.
A lot of healing had to happen with the land. We had to cap the oil wells. Over the years, it kind of became a dump site. We had to clear out thousands of tires from the site.
From a dumping ground to a spectacular design, it shows off both the summer and the winter solstice.
So the building itself, the facility itself, is really designed like a cosmological clock. There are two circles that intersect together. The larger circle is this giant earthen structure. It's based on a mound structure from our ancestors that were here.
You guess which bone is in which.
Interactive games will let the kids learn to play a hand game involving a bone. Visitors will also see and learn about sports figures like Jim Thorpe, the Olympic gold medalist. Visitors will also see an exhibit showing the misrepresentation of Native Americans in comic books, romance novels, and even mascots. On the second floor are artifacts from the Smithsonian Native American collection, like this hat from a Modoc person. Art is a huge part of the museum, from giant wall murals painted on copper to a large pottery piece by Jerry Redcorn, who is Caddo. After walking through the exhibits, guests can get a taste of some indigenous foods at the 39 restaurant. There, Chef Loretta Barrett Oden will serve you everything from butternut squash soup, bison burgers, to sweet corn and lavender creme brulee.
So using the ingredients that are indigenous here to Oklahoma, but then also from the tribe's homelands, original homelands, I'll never run out of an ingredient base to use. So I'm pretty much using everything I can find that is indigenous to some point in the Americas to put on this menu.
The food comes from all indigenous peoples to reflect the variety, just like the exhibit reflects the variety of the people.
Want them to understand the great diversity we have among our tribes. A lot of people think we're all the same, or we have the same languages or the same beliefs.
They also tell me that their museum curator staff is 100% Native American. In Oklahoma, Caitlin Onawa Boycell, Indian Country Today.
The museum opens this weekend with 2 days of special events. And that will do it for Indian Country Today. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Join us again tomorrow.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This is Indian Country Today.